Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today in Shanghai. I'm delighted and honoured at the opportunity to share with you some information about the blockchain ecosystem in Australia. And thank you to the Longshang Group for making that possible. This is my fourth visit to China and my third visit to Shanghai. And every time I come here, I'm amazed at the pace and scale of change in China. It's truly something to be proud of. I come from Sydney, which is a very different city to Shanghai. For a start, we're a much smaller city, only 5 million people. But one thing we have in common is the shared bicycle phenomenon. So if you do come to Sydney, just as in Shanghai, you too will have the opportunity to fall over a shared bicycle when you leave your apartment building in the morning. Now, the reason I tell that story though, the serious reason I tell that story, is that good ideas travel fast across borders. And the shared bicycle is a good idea that has moved around the world very fast. Blockchain too is a phenomenon that is not only moving fast across borders, but in many ways it's allowing commerce and communication that accelerates through borders in new ways, a true force for globalization in our economy. So I'd like to share a little bit about Australia's role in the blockchain ecosystem. So firstly, to introduce myself, I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Digital Commerce Association. And we are the industry association that represents blockchain businesses in Australia. And currently have around about 60 members, and they range from some of the largest companies in Australia to organizations that are startup organizations that are truly just one man or one woman with a brilliant idea. We're growing by about 2 or 3 new members every month. When most people around the world think about blockchain in Australia, the company they're most likely to know about is the Australian Securities Exchange, who famously back in 2015 identified this opportunity of blockchain and began some work to deploy clearance and settlements platforms, or a new clearance and settlement platform using blockchain. They don't quite like me to say it this way, but my friends at the ASX are probably still the world's only too big to fail blockchain deployment. And what I mean by that is, of course, if they get it wrong, the stakes are very high. You can't afford to let your national stock exchange deploy a platform that doesn't work. And this is actually a good thing, because what it means is that not only is the Australian Securities Exchange itself taking very seriously the due diligence and the testing and the development of its solution, but so are the regulators, who are thinking very carefully and making sure that when this system is deployed, it truly will be bulletproof and 100% reliable. So it's making sure that the solution will be fully commercialized. Another important player in the blockchain ecosystem, and in fact in the global ecosystem for blockchain, is Standards Australia. So I think most people in this room would be aware that Standards Australia is managing the global secretariat for the International Standards Organization, TC307, which is developing the global standards for blockchain and distributed ledger solutions. It's been my honor here in Shanghai this week to have meetings with the China Electronic Standardization Institute and to work on cooperation on how some of China's great work in evolving those standards can be given full visibility in the international process. We also have an important government research agency, Data61, who are leading Australia's scientific research in the blockchain area, along with the other technologies that you can see there. Importantly, and we've heard this from a number of speakers today, they hold the view that blockchain is not only an important technology in its own right, but also a key integrating technology for many of these other solutions, AI, big data, IoT, etc. And they recently put out a report that highlights the opportunities for the Australian economy, but for any economy in fact, on what the use of blockchain technology could bring over the next 10 or 15 years. And at ADCA, we are working with the Scientific Research Agency to help them develop a roadmap for what that might look like in Australia. Australia's big banks are also very active players in the blockchain ecosystem. These 4 banks are all in the top 50 banks in the world. They are some of the most profitable banks in the world. What you may not know is that in Australia, each of them represents at least 20% market share, and collectively around about 92% market share. So these 4 banks are very, very big players in the Australian economy. And they all have very active blockchain programs. Between them, around about 60 proofs of concept over the last 2 years. One of those has now moved to the first stages of commercialization. So the bank guarantee is a very old financial product, but still a very important financial product. And I guess because it is a little bit old, the way it was managed and administrated was very out of date, and in fact very, very paper-based. So a perfect opportunity for blockchain disruption. And in fact, ANZ and Westpac just recently have launched a new blockchain-based bank guarantee product. They were quite clever about the way they did that, starting with only a small network of 4 participants, but now actually expanding that technology and bringing it to commercial scale by bringing in new partners. Correspondent banking is another area of opportunity, and in this case, ANZ and the American bank Wells Fargo have cooperated on a proof of concept to look at whether or not the Nostro and Vostro accounts that banks maintain with one another, correspondent banking, could actually be eliminated using a single shared ledger. The POC was successful, but as has been highlighted by other speakers, some of the commercial issues still need to be overcome before that can be deployed. And in trade finance, a solution has been trialled that actually involved China as well. Commonwealth Bank and again Wells Fargo developed a trade finance solution which was trialled for a bale of American cotton that was exported here to China, and SkuChain was the blockchain partner in that solution. In the payment space, PwC, of course, is a global company, but Australia was actually the home base for the work that they have done to develop their Vulcan platform, which is a blockchain-based secure digital currency and identity platform. Supply chain, I think, is probably one of the most interesting areas for blockchain in the immediate term, and that's been highlighted by a number of people. The companies you can see there, PwC, Australia Post, Blackmores, and China's own Alibaba Group, have been working on a supply chain solution to test the authenticated provenance of Australian exports to China. And I'm happy to say that Australia also has a very active startup sector. Not only these, but many more startups are creating new products in the blockchain space in Australia. A number of accelerators are helping them do that. 3 of the startups you can see there, DigitalX, Civic Ledger and FlashFX are part of an Australian delegation that have come to this meeting in Shanghai. So if you want to learn more, I'd encourage you to reach out to them. So let me talk a little bit about the regulators in Australia. The first of them I'd like to talk about is AUSTRAC. AUSTRAC is the Australian money laundering and counter-terrorist financing or financial crimes regulator. And I'm very pleased to say that in this space of regulation for digital currency, I think in Australia we pioneered an exciting model. Although the regulators were very interested in the issue around AML and CTF for digital currency, it was actually the industry that stepped up and said to the regulators, you guys are moving too slow. So we as an industry actually developed a self-regulatory code of conduct, a best practice code of conduct, that was launched almost a year ago now. And if you're interested, you can find that code of conduct on the ADCA website. And it sets some standards for money laundering and counter-terrorist financing that we believe are best practice not only for Australia but for the whole world. We worked closely with the regulators in developing that, and now in fact the Australian Parliament is about to pass laws that will bring formal regulation to the sector. But because of the work that we did in industry and building deep relationships and trusted relationships with the regulators, a lot of the detail of that law is actually very similar, is based upon the code of conduct that we created. So this has been a real opportunity to create a partnership with the regulator for everybody's benefit. ASIC is Australia's securities regulator, and as we just heard, ASIC 2 is one of a number of countries, or Australia 2 is one of a number of countries where the regulation of token offerings has become a priority, and ASIC has recently announced that it plans to develop regulation for this area. This is an area where, once again, we believe a very useful model will be for industry to establish self-regulatory standards, best practice standards, and work with the regulator to help them understand those standards, get their feedback, of course, but collectively create a higher standard that both industry and regulators can rely on. The other two regulators I mentioned there, APRA is our wealth management and prudential regulator, and they are looking very closely at the use of blockchain in funds management, wealth management solutions, understanding that there's a lot of inefficiency in the back office processes for business in that area, and the blockchain deployed well could actually solve that problem. And the Reserve Bank of Australia is our central bank, and they have begun some work on the creation of a digital currency, as other central banks are also looking at those issues. So I guess I'd like to close my remarks by making some comments about potential cooperation between Australia and China in the blockchain space. Firstly, I mentioned the development of technical standards. So Australia clearly is running the Global Secretariat for the International Standards Organization. And here in China this week, I've seen some of the great work that the CESI has been doing in developing technical standards and blockchain reference architecture. So the first point of cooperation is for Australia to help facilitate full Chinese contribution to that process. But the interesting thing about standards is that standards by themselves don't really drive business forward. What drives business forward is the opportunity to experiment and test and apply standards or check standards and see how they work in the real world. So I guess the opportunity that I see is for some joint POCs between commercial players in China and commercial players in Australia to actually trial in real life what those solutions do, how well they work, and to take learning from that we can then apply to the development of standards. There are many areas where joint POCs are possible. Some of Australia's RegTech ideas are quite leading edge and offer possibilities for markets here in China. Some of Australia's ideas on how to tokenize government registries and create government license registries using blockchains could also be quite interesting in China. But I think the obvious point of greatest potential cooperation is on supply chain and provenance and trade finance. And what I would very much like to see is a number of experiments emerge in that space where we're able to create trusted supply chains where a Chinese consumer can take a digital certificate of authenticity, of origin, of quality, and know for sure that behind that is a transparent supply chain that proves with 100% certainty that it is a high-quality Australian export. So this is definitely one area where we would like to see some cooperation emerging between Australia and China in blockchain. So I welcome the opportunity to pursue that conversation with anybody here who's interested, and thank you once again for the opportunity to contribute today.